Hey, so tonight we will be finishing the General Writing Principles unit. So this is part 2 of General Writing Principles, and tonight's topic is going to be about message organization. The things we will be looking at in message organization are going to be grouping ideas, choosing a pattern, and the direct and indirect approaches. So let's get started. Okay, grouping ideas. So well-organized messages group similar items together. Ideas follow a sequence that helps the reader understand the relationship between everything that's going on in your writing, and it helps people accept your point of view. If you are writing and you're jumping all over the place, nobody will follow you and they won't understand, and they will probably put your paper down and stop reading it altogether. So it's important to keep ideas that are similar together so that we don't have an idea up here and then you have another paragraph and then it's down here. Keep them together. Communication experts regard poor organization as the greatest failing of business writing. Remember what we talked about. You want to be direct, you want to be concise, and this is something else you have to pay attention to, is where your ideas are, how it's flowing. So there are a few tips that can help you when you're making an outline. So make sure that you define. Tell me what it's going to be about by the title. So if you're reading a book, for example, and it says Murder on Fifth Avenue, you pick it up and you know that the book is going to be a murder mystery, probably. So tell us in the title. If this is a memo, tell us in the subtitle or in the heading. If it's an email, tell us in the subject. What is this going to be about? Make sure that you divide the topic into main points. Usually, this is 3 to 5 points. Think about a standard essay structure where you usually have 5 paragraphs, your intro, your 3 supporting paragraphs, and then your conclusion. It's similar with your business writing. If you have several points to cover, try to get them down to 3 to 5 points. Also, components, sub-points. So if you have a big overarching topic and several things to talk about under it, you can have subtitles. So it's okay to have, example here, we have grouping. Make a subtitle here. I might say, this is tips. Right? So it's okay to do this as well, and it's another way to keep your writing organized. Now, don't go crazy, because sometimes adding subtitles can make the piece look congested and there's too much going on. But sometimes it's useful and it can help direct your reader's attention, especially if they're reading a large document and they're just looking for something specific. They can just find that subtitle and go right to that point. Some other things to be aware of. Don't put a single item under a major component if you only have one subpoint for it. So integrate this with the main item above it or reorganize your writing. So one thing cannot stand on its own. Again, think of it like an essay. You have to have supporting details. You have to have several subpoints. So if it's just, oh yeah, this one thing, try to incorporate that with something else. Maybe that can be supporting details or a subpoint under another topic. Strive to make each component exclusive. You don't want there to be overlapping. You don't want the reader to read your memo or read your proposal and think, oh my gosh, they're just saying the same thing over and over again. No. So try to make sure you have a few ideas in there, you have things that change as you go along, and that you have several points to make, not just one thing over and over. And also make sure that you use details, illustrations, and evidence to support your subpoints. Again, just like going back to writing essays when you were in school, you need to have evidence to support these subpoints. So if you say something is a wonderful product and one of your subpoints is because the battery life is 8 hours and the batteries will last 6 years on this 8-hour charge as long as you take care of it, you need to have evidence to support that. Sometimes you can use statistics, sometimes you would use a quote, all kinds of things. So just make sure that you are supporting your ideas. So let's look at the format for an outline. I'm just going to move this so it's all on one page and it'll be easier to see. All right, here it is, nice and simple. You have your title, which is the major purpose of the essay and it's going to be about, right? Just like I said with the title of a book, you want to know what you're getting into. Then you have your first major component, your first major point about your topic. Then you have a subpoint and a second subpoint, and sometimes you might have a third subpoint, depending on what you're speaking about or what you're writing about. And each subpoint needs to have details / illustration / evidence all the way down. Up. All the way down. Every step has to have details or evidence, something to support it. So these are okay. So that's pretty straightforward. You have your title. You usually, in this outline here, they say you have 2 main components. Each component has 2 subsections or 2 subpoints, and you always have to have a couple pieces, not just one, a couple pieces of evidence to support your point. All right. Now, something else that's important is how are you going to deliver this material? Well, there you have a couple options. You can choose to go with a direct pattern or an indirect pattern. So after you develop the outline, you need to decide on where in the message you will place the main idea. And choosing between the direct and indirect methods will influence where this main idea goes. So in preparing to write any message, you need to anticipate the audience's reaction to your ideas and frame your message accordingly. So you need to know your audience. You need to think about the subject matter, the material. What are you talking about? Is this sensitive? Will it be sensitive for this particular audience? So you use the direct method when you expect the reader to be pleased, maybe mildly interested, or at worst they're neutral about your topic. So like, whatever. In the direct pattern, the main idea comes first. This is called front loading. Again later in some of our lectures. So the main idea comes first. This is called front loading. And then it is followed by details and explanation or evidence and so on and so forth, like we saw in the outline. In the indirect pattern, it's more appropriate when you expect the audience to be uninterested, unwilling, or displeased, or maybe even hostile about your message or the product or what you're talking about. So in this pattern, you don't really reveal the main idea until after you have offered your explanations and your evidence. So the main idea comes closer to the end in the indirect pattern. So this is something to keep in mind. You need to know the difference between these. So direct pattern uses front loading. You bring the idea right up at the beginning. You tell them what it's going to be about. Here we go. And then you support your details and hope that they agree. In the indirect pattern, you go through all of these wonderful things, all of your details, your explanation, and then you deliver your main point. So again, you really need to know your audience and what you're talking about when you're deciding between these 2 patterns. So now just briefly, we'll compare the direct and indirect patterns in the following memo openings. So notice how long it takes in the indirect pattern or the indirect opening to get to that main idea. So we'll read that first. For the past several years, we have had a continuing problem scheduling vacations, personal days, and sick time. Our human resources people struggle with unscheduled absences. After a considerable investigation, the Management Council has decided to try a centralized paid time off program starting January 1st. This memo will describe its benefits and procedures. Now, let's look at the direct opening. This memo describes the benefits and procedures of a new paid time off program that begins January 1st. Wow, big difference, right? So when you were reading through the indirect opening, was it obvious what the main point was? Did it pop out at you when you got there? Did you realize when you got to the end that, okay, we're talking about procedures but what did you notice about this approach? It gives a whole bunch of details, explanation, like a justification on why they're writing this memo before they tell you why they're writing this memo. Versus the direct approach or the direct opening where they just say, okay, people, this memo is being sent out and it's talking about new paid off time in January. That starts in January. And then if that continued, like if they continued with the direct approach, you would see later in the memo that then they would bring up, oh, we're having problems with sick time and personal days. Then they would talk about all of that. Okay, so when do you use the direct approach? So I've mentioned a few things, but we're going to talk about a couple more. So you use it when you are writing or composing routine goodwill messages, and when the message is going to be received well. So positive reaction here. You also use it when the main idea is stated at the beginning. Followed by supporting details. And of course, for routine request and response. You can think of times where, like if you're just replying to a friend or even in a business situation, if you're replying to an email, that you use a direct approach to say like a yes or no or whatever you're doing. You don't with direct approach of saying, well, la 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 la, maybe this, oh yeah, then. No. So for routine requests and responses, it just makes more sense to use the direct approach. Like imperatives, maybe even when placing an order, you don't call the pizza guy and say, oh man, I really like mushrooms and I like a meaty sauce and lots of mozzarella and oh my gosh, all the flavors are so good and I think I'm gonna order some pizza and I'd like it to be delivered. Not quite. It's kind of the other way around. You call and say, I'd like to place an order for takeout or delivery or whatever you're doing, and then you tell them what you want. So you start with the main idea. I'm calling you because I want some pizza. All right. You also use this for acknowledgements. You also use it for acknowledgements. So when you're giving a speech at the company dinner at the end of the year at Christmas, or when you're presenting an award, sometimes when you're presenting an award, if it's a surprise, you might use the indirect approach. You might not want to stand up there and say, oh, congratulations, Sally won, this is great. But usually when you're acknowledging someone for something, then you bring up their name close to the beginning and you say why you're acknowledging them. And of course, this is also used when you know your audience. So if you're speaking with a friend or someone, like even your boss, if you're comfortable with them, if it's about something that they should receive well, then direct approach. So there are things to using this approach, and those are that it saves the reader time. So if you front load, then the reader can look at your opening paragraph and read it and know what it's about, and then decide if they want to continue. excuse me, like I said before, if you have subpoints and subtitles, things like that, they can jump through and find what they really want to read. So people receive hundreds of messages nowadays, and they don't want to be spending half an hour reading just your email or just your memo. So direct approach saves time. It also sets up the proper frame of mind. So learning the purpose up front helps the reader put the subsequent details and explanations into perspective. So if you don't know what this is about and why they're telling you, like up here, let's go back a little bit. If you don't know why they're telling you about issues with scheduling vacations, personal days, and sick time, if they go on and on about this, then you're looking at these details and thinking, oh my goodness, like, come on, get to the point already. I don't know what they're talking about. It's not in context. So using the direct approach also helps with that. And as you could probably tell from what I just said, it also helps prevent frustration. So your readers might be looking at your memo or your email and just being, oh my gosh, would you get to the point already? It really helps prevent frustration because poorly organized messages create a negative impression of the writer. It doesn't make them want to write you back or respond. So typical business messages really do follow the direct pattern, which includes emails, memos, informational reports, informational oral presentations even, usually use the direct approach. And all of these have one element in common, that none has a sensitive subject that will upset the reader. So this approach is most appropriate, again, when the message will be received positively. Now let's look at the indirect approach. So using this approach is similar to the direct approach, where you need to know your audience. You use this approach to embed the purpose in the message, and you usually open the message with an explanation or a compliment, especially when you're delivering bad news and you're trying to persuade someone of something. So you probably know this from going to school in Canada, that usually we use a method that's called the sandwich method, where teachers will give feedback with a positive, and then maybe the negative or the thing we think you should improve on, and then another positive. This is similar to the indirect approach, where we don't just come out and say, okay, you need to fix this, 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 and this. I'll see you in class tomorrow. So opening with a compliment is good when you are delivering bad news. This approach is most commonly used for negative messages and for persuasive messages, which we will talk more about in class. So placing the main idea later in the message or after the details, after the explanation and evidence, is called the indirect pattern. And when you expect the audience to be uninterested, unwilling, displeased, hostile, grumpy, whatever, then this is a much more appropriate method to use. In this pattern, you don't have to reveal the main idea until after you have offered the evidence and the explanation. So after you have justified why you are writing this, then you tell them. So this approach works well with three kinds of messages: bad news, ideas that require persuasion, and sensitive news, especially when you're telling a superior. So the indirect pattern has three main benefits as well. It respects the feelings of the audience, because bad news is always painful, but the trauma can be lessened when the receiver's prepared for it. So when you give that explanation, if you think about movies or books that you've read and you see the police officer come in to tell them that their family member has passed away or something terrible has happened, they always use the indirect approach. They have them, please sit down. Maybe they ask a question like, when's the last time you saw them? Or, I just wanted to let you know something terrible has happened. There's a lot of this, like what we would call hedging, where they don't want to kind of be upfront. They don't want to tell the bad news right away. The indirect approach also encourages a fair hearing. So messages that may be upsetting to the reader are more likely to be read all the way through when the main idea is delayed. So beginning immediately with a piece of bad news or the persuasive request may cause the reader to stop because they're not interested. But if you have taken the time to back up your argument and give evidence and try to persuade them of your opinion or to use your product or whatever it is, then they're more likely to watch your ad all the way through or read your piece. And it also minimizes the negative reaction that could occur. So a reader's overall reaction to a negative message is generally improved if the news is delivered gently. So most people would rather be told bad news in a gentle manner than just straight up front and here it is. That's how it is. So typical business messages that could be developed indirectly include letters and memos that refuse a request. So if you have to write back to a customer or a client and say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to accept this or do this, or we don't carry this, or whatever it may be, you probably will want to use the indirect approach because you have to justify why you're not doing it. This also is used commonly for denying claims or denying credit. So persuasive request, sales letters, sensitive messages, and some reports, sometimes oral presentations, depends on what you're talking about, may also benefit from this indirect strategy. All right, so that's all for today. I hope that you now know the difference between the direct and the indirect approach and when to use them. And I will see you in class to continue on. Bye.